Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to invite the Prime Minister to give a speech not exceeding 7 minutes. Here.
Am I audible? Panel, police brutality is an act of evil that condemns the innocent to atrocity. But equally, we believe that it is morally reprehensible to refuse to prevent the act of evil when you have the knowledge and capacity to prevent it. That's why we're very proud to stand on opening government. By the way of setup, our stance is twofold. Firstly, judges are to examine the ability of commanders to prevent an act of police brutality. That means if a commander was just appointed to the position of power within the past month, that means that person is unlikely to be punished in the same way that a commander that's been in the position for 10 years would be. The second part is obviously judges are going to examine the extent to which a commander has made the effort to prevent an act of police brutality. That means if a police commander did mandate its subordinates to be equipped with body cameras, for example, that means that commander is unlikely to be punished or likely to be punished in a reduced manner. I'm going to talk to you about two things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to tell you why this is a morally obligatory extension of responsibility and culpability. Secondly, I'm going to tell you why this reduces brutality as a whole. So firstly...
Clarification.
This is a clarification.
From
yes.
Opening opposition?
Yeah.
Yeah, so how is this different from the existing mechanism in civil law where you try police departments for negligence?
So we're obviously going to impose criminal liability. That means we're happy to lock these people up in prison if that's fair, if that's deemed fair by the decisions of judges. That's the distinction. So firstly, why is this morally obligatory extension of responsibility? The crux of this argument is that negligence is equally morally reprehensible. That we believe that just in the same way that failing to act if you are a policeman when a person is physically beaten in front of you, that they're just in the same way that's morally reprehensible, we think this is too. Therefore, the first thing I want to show is why these police commanders can be expected to act in advance. And that's because we think police brutality doesn't just pop out of thin air, that these commanders are likely to be informed in various ways previously. The first thing is the process of employment. That means these commanders are likely to have background knowledge or things like the history of violence in the past that shows the propensity of those individuals to be susceptible to police brutality in the future. You also have an information as to whether or not these individuals are mentally compromised. That means if these people are put in positions or situations of desperate situations, whether or not that person is likely to commit an act of brutality. But also recognize the intimacy of relationship between a police commander and their subordinates. That means they're likely to have conversations on a daily basis. That means they're likely to cooperate in tackling a certain case. That means the police commander is likely to notice when an individual is discriminatory, when an individual has a level of discriminatory view against a particular minority group, when a person uses way too much insulting words about a particular minority group, when a person uses N-words way too much. That's when these people are likely to know whether or not a person is discriminatory. But also recognize that police brutality is a recurring event. That means these police officers all verbally abuse the minority groups on a daily basis. That means these commanders are likely to receive complaints from the community, for example, no thank you, beforehand. That means these police commanders are likely to have information about whether or not these individuals are susceptible to an act of police brutality beforehand. Why do we then think these commanders have an ability to control the occurrence of police brutality? We think that if you are a top-level police officer, you are able to make people redundant on the basis of their discriminatory views. But we think even if that's not true, even if you are a mere commander, we think there's a level of control that you have in the status quo. That's because you have control over allocation of personnel between different police stations. That means you can move away the people who have discriminatory views from the area of minority communities. That also means these commanders have an ability to choose who goes patrolling out into society and who stays within police stations working at desk. That means these police commanders have a significant level of control over who interacts with the community. That means these people have the choice to engage in the prevention, but also recognize that there's a variety of preventive measures that an individual can take beforehand in order to prevent police brutality. For example, police commanders can mandate their subordinates to be equipped with body cameras. They can do things like education to prevent the types of discriminatory views that can be seen in the status quo. And that means these commanders are able to do so, able to act in preventive ways, and we think that's massively important. In addition to all of these, recognize that the extent of responsibility that is relied upon the commanders is particularly high, especially within the organization of police. And that's because of the paucity of alternative in the status quo. And that's because of the militaristic culture that exists within police organizations. That means that means an emphasis is put upon solidarity and loyalty. That means there's always a peer pressure to act in what the group wants you to do. That also means that you cannot expect whistleblowing to happen from within organizations. You cannot expect a rank and file police officer to whistleblow within a particular organization. That's because when an individual does so, there's always a risk of putting your future prospective promotion at risk. There's always
information.
There's also a risk of being bullied within that police organization. That means, as a commander, you are the only individual to be able to deal with it, to be able to possibly deal with this situation. We think it's relatively easy for you to do so as a commander. We think that's why these people are responsible for the act of police brutality. No, thank you. Note, we think this is of utmost importance in today's debate, because we think criminalization and punishment is deprivation of rights, and that means punishment needs to be proportionate to the culpability, to the level of offense that an individual have caused. And that means if an individual has certain level of responsibility, that means in turn you can enforce a certain type of punishment. That's why this argument was of utmost importance in today's debate. Secondly, I want to show that this reduces brutality. The first part is that it's obviously deterrence, right? We think that's because in the status quo, there's relatively minimal incentive for commanders to do anything about police brutality because you're not going to be punished anyway. But we think that incentive is going to be enhanced under our paradigm in relation to all of the things that I've talked about in my first argument. But it means in short term, police brutality is reduced. But also recognize that institutional changes are likely to take place under our paradigm. That's because discrimination is oftentimes institutionalized. That means and that's facilitated by overrepresentation of white officers, for example. That's likely to change in our paradigm because in order for commanders to prevent police brutality from happening in the first place, the easiest way for you to do so is to root out the cause of it in the first instance. That means these commanders are likely to be more careful about when selecting white officers, for example. They're likely to do things like background checks, but also there's going to be an increased presence of black people, Latino population. That means the cause of police brutality is likely to be tackled on the outside of the house. We think this is not contingent on practicality. We think at the point at which we prove responsibility, that wins us the debate. But even if that's not the case, we reduce brutality, and that's why we're very proud to propose.
Great. I thank that speaker and call upon the leader of opposition, here.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Right. Ladies and gentlemen, the bullet that killed Ahmaud Arbery was triggered by a single police officer. That process did not involve A, the mental intention of his commander to commit the crime, and B, the direct participation of that commanding officer in directing his subordinate to commit that crime. In opening opposition, we stand for the idea that the criminal court is reserved for matters where a single individual can be criminally responsible for the particular situation that occurred. I'll jump straight into that definition then. Why is it that a criminal court is especially unique? Because in every crime, there's two especially important elements you ought to be able to prove in a court of law to get a conviction. The first being the direct participation, i.e. with the sufficient nexus between the action of that police commander and the crime that occurred, and B, the mens rea, i.e. the mental intention of the particular commander to commit that crime. Why is that important? It's important when you juxtapose this to the existing legal mechanisms that exist to cater to instances of vicarious liability. My POI to Prime Minister is especially important because there already exists the concept of negligence in police departments in civil trials. The crucial difference here is this. in civil trials, you hold the entire police department liable. And similarly, you also then hold the remedies like offered on a group basis in the form of damages to the victim's family. In contrast, the matter, like in contrast of a criminal trial, the difference is you hold a single individual criminally responsible. Therefore, the burden on side opening government was never to prove that there was a connection between the commander and the subordinate. The burden was significantly higher. The burden was to prove that the commanding officer was directly implicated in the crime and had either A, directly participated or had the intention to commit that crime. I'll divide my speech into three issues. Firstly, just a bunch of clarifications. Secondly, why instances of police brutality should be left to the civil courts. And thirdly, why it's harder to prosecute crimes of police brutality, because really you align the incentives of the police commander with the police subordinate in instances of police brutality. Firstly, some clarifications. What do we support? Firstly, we support extensive measures to regulate and supervise conduct that already exists. Things like body cams to supervise the conduct of police officers, things like dash cams, things like having like vast investigations in police departments. Notice that it was contingent in the Prime Minister's speech to explain why these existing mechanisms were insufficient. I don't think that they did that in that speech. Secondly, we support trying the subordinate in a criminal court as a perpetrator, using the standard procedures where the mens rea and the actus reus of the particular subordinate was investigated. We don't see why that's already like insufficient, and we also think that was a burden that Prime Minister needed to discharge, but did not exist in that particular scenario. Right, second issue then. Why is it that instances of police brutality should be left to the civil courts when you draw the vicarious sort of liability that open government wants in this debate? Right, so we agree with Prime Minister that we agree with the Prime Minister that there is a nexus between the commander and the subordinate, but there's two problems here. The first is that the Prime Minister doesn't explain why just because there's that connection, that means that this passes the threshold where something can be considered a crime and tried in a criminal court. Notice that he didn't prove that. But secondly, this does not prove that a relationship exists of like participation solely in that chain of command. We support that even in the worst case scenario where the commander explicitly instructs the subordinate to murder and explicitly instructs the subordinate to engage in police brutality, we say that that still shouldn't be tried in a criminal court. We say that that's a civil wrong, because all the things that the Prime Minister said with respect to the atmosphere that encourages police brutality in the Prime Minister's speech are all matters that highlight a group problem, highlight the problem that it is the police department's fault and not a single individual's. Why is this important? It's important for the material I gave you earlier with respect to why you can't ever pin down an individual's participation when it comes to complex group dynamics with respect to police brutality. Therefore, all OP really has to prove is that instances of police brutality cannot be tied down to the individual. We can, in fact, agree that this is an entirely there's entirely too many contributive elements inside that police department to ever hold a single individual liable. So why is it that police brutality doesn't run along a chain of command, but rather exists throughout that group as a whole? Firstly, it's symptomatic of the department's apathy to prosecute. Just as Prime Minister's analysis might indicate, along the entire training career of the commander, if he was found to be influenced by sentiments of racial bias that permit such actions, or even apathy of surrounding the use of force that might be able to be used liberally, those are all instances in which the department had the ability to prosecute but didn't. So in those cases, it's unclear why then the specific police commander ought to be liable for a crime committed by a subordinate and not just rely on the existing civil mechanism in order to prosecute. But secondly, it's also an evidence of a lack of internal controls of that department. We disagree that the police commander was responsible for department-wide things, like say for example instituting body cams on police officers. I don't think that's the police commander's job, but rather the entire police department's obligation to fight for in the first place. These are all matters where fault lies within the department, not a singular individual. Thusly, it's unfair to prosecute in the criminal court. Before I move on, I'll take a quick POI.
Question. Yeah. Your case is premised on the assertion that criminal prosecutions require mens rea. Manslaughter, parental negligence, and other crimes don't require it. Why is this true?
Because parental negligence is actually a civil wrong, by the way, because it is separate from the crime of battery, starvation, So there is a significant difference there with respect to mens rea. But even if that's not the case, that's still assuming that the police commander directly participated in the particular action that happened, in particular like brutality that happened. That's still something you need to prove. Last issue, why is it harder to prosecute crimes of police brutality? Under the status quo, we agree on two characterizations. First, that there exists a culture of silence and camaraderie in the police department. And secondly, that we rely on existing mechanisms to prosecute, i.e. evidence and fact-finding, things like recordings of dash cams, things like testimonies of relevant officers. The problem is introducing the possibility that the commander could be prosecuted also incentivizes him to do things like intimidating witnesses, i.e. in the Tamir Rice case, or turning body cams off, or in the Trayvon Martin case. Whereas previously the incentive existed to cooperate, now the incentive exists to cover their own footprints because now their ass is also on the line. I'm very proud to oppose.
I thank the Leader of Opposition and call upon the Deputy Prime Minister here.
Hello, can everybody?
Yeah?
Yeah, sorry. I actually have to go. Is that all right?
Yes.
All right. Thank you, guys. Sorry for the definition challenge. Bye.
Okay.
Panel, the only time that you're held accountable is not when you had an intent to do wrong, but when you had the responsibility to do right, and you had the capability to do it, and you were the only one that could do it, and yet you were negligent in doing so. Notice that none of Elo's arguments actually engage with what Tota gave you in telling you that the commander is the only person that can solve this problem, that a group cannot fix itself because there's pressure and militaristic standards that exist within it. We don't think any of Elo's points actually engaged with Tota's material. So I'm going to talk about three things today. First, I'm going to talk about why civil courts don't work. Second, I'm going to engage with their point about intent and why these commanders actually do have control over what happens in police stations. And lastly, I'm going to talk about their last little argument about how commanders are going to have an incentive to hide facts or like turn off body cameras and such, right? So firstly, about civil courts. So the first thing they said was that it's not the commander that should be personally held liable, but it is the group that should be held liable, right? But the problem is, in order for that to stand, they had to tell us why the group could fix all the problems they gave us, things like bias, things like structural problems, to begin with, when we told you that they clearly couldn't, because police groups tend to be focused around militaristic things like loyalty, like following your commander, because they're often put together in life and death situations. They often couldn't opt out or couldn't rat each other out. We think we saw this in the case where when a man ratted out the fact that his partner had like done police brutality, he was severely bullied by his coworkers. He had dead animals put on his desk. He had death threats put on his desk. We think that this proves that it's extremely hard for individuals within the group to change the structure. But we told you that commanders could, right? They could filter out people who had past problems with violence through things like rigorous interviews. They could actually make sure that like co-workers that seemed unstable that day or seemed prone to violence didn't go to patrol alone and had a senior advisor with them. They had the unique power to control the structure within that group, which is why we said that individual was liable and not the group, right? But secondly, they said that there's already exists an incentive to care about negligence because of civil courts. But notice that often the victims of police brutality are minorities and Black people, Latinos, because they're often subject to racist views that say, these people are dangerous, these people are criminal. Often these people have low incomes, which means they can't afford good lawyers. They can't take days off of work to engage in civil courts to hold these policemen accountable, which means it's often rare that, at least specifically in the case of police brutality, that civil courts can function and that people have the money to make sure that police are held accountable by civil courts. So we think that compared to that, at least criminal courts, like the state steps in and does it for you, so it doesn't push the burden on the victims, right? We think it's a more feasible policy. But moving on to the second point about control, right? How they said that there was going to be no control over these police police commanders didn't necessarily have control. Firstly, we told you that there can be some mitigation of punishment depending on these people's individual circumstances. For example, if you clearly knew about what was happening, you would probably be punished heavier. But if you were just appointed to the police officer as a police commander, you didn't know everybody there, obviously we can mitigate your sentence. We could adjust that for proportionality. But secondly, we told you that proportionality. But secondly, we told you that often in these cases, these policemen are liable, right? We give you tons of analysis about how these like police officers, police commanders often do things like lose checks in interviews, as in they like neglect looking at files, looking through these people's past histories of violence. For example, the like police officer that killed Tamir Rice clearly had files saying that he was a deranged beyond repair.
Right.
Nevertheless, the police commander did not read those documents, and therefore he committed another crime and killed another like helpless victim, right? Often there are things like daily communication, like checking these people's past files, things like body cameras that these people can do to make sure that these people don't commit police brutality, right? Which means that often brutality is just an act of laziness or just the laziness on the side of the commander, right? And then they said, but we don't hold normal people to that account. But notice that these are police commanders, right? As in they train and command policemen, which carry guns, which carry violence, which are able to invade people's rights in ways that other people cannot. These people are commanders of violence within the state. They should be held to a different standard from just the average citizen. So we think that even if the bar is high and the standard of responsibility we hold them to is quite high, we think that they should live up to that burden at the extent where they're handling the lives and deaths of the citizens on the ground, right? But thirdly, let's take their best case, and I'll take you after this point, right? Let's take their best case to say that some people are unfairly treated, right? Some people are unfairly thrown over the bus. Why do we still think it's better, right? So even if we conceded that, notice that what they have to fight for on their side of the house is innocent minorities being killed on the streets, literally because there's nobody to hold them accountable, for hold police officers accountable for police brutality, because these people can't afford to sue them with civil courts, because these people don't necessarily have those means, right? We say that, and considering that there's innocent victims on both sides of the house, we prefer that an innocent policeman is thrown to jail for 2 years compared to an innocent Black man being killed and his family have to suffer for that trauma for the rest of their lives. We simply think that the extent of harm that happens to these individuals is different. So even if we take their best case, we still think it doesn't stand. I'll take your POI.
So what about other misconducts that police officers are guilty of? Are you also going to charge the commanders as criminally liable?
I don't know what you're talking about, but I think that at the extent where police brutality is literally beating people, literally killing people, and the extent of harm that's put on the citizens is completely different. They should especially be held accountable for police brutality. So lastly, about Elo's point about how these commanders are going to have the incentive to pressure their subordinates or hide this, right? Firstly, I don't understand why that's necessarily mutually exclusive. As Tota told you, there's already a structure of group loyalty, which means that bosses already have some level of incentive to like cover their subordinates because they're affectionate of them or in order to protect their reputation. So I don't understand why throwing this one incentive and like a mountain of pre-existing incentives changes anything. But secondly, we think that there's an incentive for these commanders to not hide or not pressure their subordinates because like in the same way how if you like don't cooperate in a police investigation, or if you hide a dead body after you murdered somebody, you're likely to be held more accountable. You're likely to be punished more if you didn't cooperate with the police, if you didn't go out and admit that you did the crime right away, right? We think that at least these people have an incentive to try to lessen their punishments by going out and speaking the truth and not lying, right? But lastly, even if this wasn't true, right, notice that at best what opposition side achieves is compensation for people who have already received harms, compensation for a family of a Black man who has already been killed, whose family has already suffered, right? What we uniquely offer you on our side of the house is by having policemen more aware of what's happening, instead of thinking, it's just one bad apple, and instead thinking that's something that relates to them, we think that we can make sure that more cases of police brutality don't happen by installing more rigorous checks and body cameras. We think that preventing that scar from existing is better than just putting a meaningless band-aid over it. For these reasons, happy to propose.
Great. I thank that speaker and call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here. Hold on, I'm just getting my time. and gentlemen, punishing the wrong actor not only creates massive complacency and prevents us from addressing systemic problems, but it also means the miscarrying of justice and making commanders responsible for every little action that these police officers are expected to be able to follow on their own and not carry out, right? So for example, on their side, the principle is that commanders are able to regulate all of the actions of their police officers, of all of their subordinates. The follow through of that logic is that we can therefore hold them responsible for any little wrongdoing, which I think is completely unfair. Two questions to cement or win in this debate, right? First, is it even fair to try them to begin with? And second, does this lead to positive outcomes for society in general? On the first question, is it fair to try them to begin with? Again, opening government merely talked about steps that could be taken to try to prevent them from committing police brutality. But as my partner pointed out, what they weren't able to do was prove that a direct involvement existed. And this is therefore a prerequisite for something to be considered a crime, for somebody to be considered for even being liable for a crime, ladies and gentlemen. But more importantly, why do we show that they are not liable and therefore don't even deserve to be tried? A, police officers are grown adults, ladies and gentlemen, grown men and women who have the capacity for free choice. So first, on the idea of mens rea, there is the mental capacity, right? These individuals are able to make that free choice on their own, decide to use lethal force against individuals like Tamil Rice, beat them up even though they are unarmed. Or for example, we think that even if in the worst case, the commander says that if you don't carry out police brutality for some reason, I will fire you, I think that that still doesn't meet the idea of vitiated consent, because that is not a direct threat to your life. You still have the ability to say no. And today it is so much easier to come forward and talk about the wrongdoings of your department and so on. But B, we say that maybe their principle was about command responsibility as we have in war crimes, right? But this is not parallel to that situation, because policemen in the department go on patrols, etc., are free to roam around, are the ones who, for example, keep their community safe. But in wars, generals and soldiers are expected to have instant, unquestioning obedience, right? They are expected to always follow what the commander does, which isn't the expectation of the police department. The police department expects you to follow the conduct of how police should act instead. But secondly, generals are always there with their battalion, but commanders are oftentimes in the office and managing more like more systemic kinds of issues rather than being on the streets and being able to patrol and make sure that each single officer he has in his precinct of 100 or more is not committing acts of police brutality, right? But let's engage. Even in the instances where they talk about all of these things to prevent negligence, right? We already showed you that negligence is a civil problem, right? A civil trial you bring to court and not a criminal trial. But we say that, sure, there are measures they could have taken, like checking background history, etc. But I think that's already the standard case anyway. What they're asking for is unreasonable and much more than that. There is an expectation that you know if someone is explicitly racist or someone is going to act violently, which is just an unreasonable expectation because that's not something you can objectively measure on their side. So we say even their standard for what constitutes negligence is incredibly unfair, and the bar is too high. The second question is, does this actually lead to positive outcomes for society? Their argument on deterrence doesn't work. First, in the instance that my partner told you, there is greater incentive to keep things hush-hush and behind closed doors. And the unique incentive here is that the commander himself will be sent to prison, right? Versus him just having his officers sent to prison because of his own actions, right? The commander would not want to go to prison and is more likely to try to hide these. And right now it is already quite hard to prosecute instances of police brutality. Their side simply makes it harder. But what we told you is that the alternative is to try them civilly instead, try the entire department, which is much, much better. Why? Because if they talk about problems like not having body cams, not having these police education camps, and talking about racial sensitivity and not imposing diversity quotas, I don't think this is a problem of the commander, guys, because the commander doesn't have the power to make all of those decisions. That is a systemic problem of the police force and of the state. So I think there is a more sustainable type of change and more meaningful change that you are able to create on our side when you try it civilly, right? When you are able to show that the police should have ABC in order to mitigate and create some sort of panopticon effect upon these police officials and prevent them from acting unjustly, right? So we think on our side, by trying it civilly, you're more likely able to set, for example, a precedence rather than trying one individual. Sure, in the best case, you get one police commander into prison for the police brutality of his subordinate, but I don't think that changes all of the things that opening government cited. Rather, it simply makes us complacent and think the problem has gone away when really it still exists, when really we still need to address a larger force. Before I move on, yeah.
So when a parent expected to feed a baby is negligent, you punish him or her. Why do you not punish a police officer who is expected to be accountable in instances in which he fails?
Yeah, so a parent is directly involved in taking care of his child, right? Whereas a police commander who is in the office, in the precinct, is not able to have a watchful eye 24/7 on each and every one of the 100 plus members of his precinct who are on patrol on different time slots, right? That's an unreasonable expectation. And second, clearly they aren't directly involved, and therefore it's principally unjust to even try them. But lastly, what is principally the harm of trying? What are the moral repercussions of doing this, right? It dilutes the level of individual accountability. On their side, police brutality isn't anymore recognized as something you actively choose to do, but now it seems like it is an unconscious trend you follow rather than a deliberate choice to act on your personal bias and racism, right? Recognize not all police officers act this way, and most of the time police brutality is committed against minorities. On their side, they are willing to dilute the fact that these individuals have incredibly racist and violent tendencies and try to say that it's because somebody else wasn't able to prevent them from acting, right? We think that is morally unjustified, and we must make sure the full extent of the law, the full force of the law is applied on this individual who pulled the trigger. Thank you.
All right, and now I would like to invite the member of government to give a speech not exceeding 7 minutes. Here.
Okay, just a sec. Okay. Let's go. Opening government is correct to identify that police commanders are responsible for criminal negligence. What they did not do, however, is demonstrate how these prosecutions would change the behavior of police chiefs and city governments. In closing government, we say that when there is a real threat of a public trial, you're far more likely as a police department and city government to be open to investigation and to make conditions better for the victims of police brutality. The comparative in this debate is that one in which there are no trials or prosecutions on op side versus some trials, we much prefer the latter. I want to do two main things in this debate. First of all, just a brief response to OO and demonstrate why specifically criminal cases are going to be far more effective than civil ones. But secondly, why at the point we get far more prosecutions and was a real threat of trial, we get actual systemic change within these police departments. First of all then, let's deal with OO. I think my POI already sort of knocked OO out of the debate at the point when there are many instances we do prosecute for criminal liability. The reason why is because individuals such as parents and police officers opt into responsibility by accruing those positions. So for example, if you're a police chief, now thank you, you opt into that responsibility because you have extraordinary levels of power, amounts of coercion over other people, such as, for example, being able to go into an area where carrying a gun or to arrest people. So it means that you have a responsibility to use that power properly, to be accountable. So at that point, we think it is that you can try these things in the criminal court, OO is largely out. Also note some further benefits why specifically this should be a criminal case as opposed to civil ones. Note that first of all, we think that police departments, when it's tried in a civil court, when it's the departmental responsibility, there's no sense of individual responsibility. So it means that you as a mayor or a police chief have just much less incentive to do actual things to the point when you individually aren't going to be held culpable. Secondly, civil cases just much less publicized. I'm going to explain later on. Thank you, why this is really important. But at the point where there's very little public attention, it means you get very little solvency and actual incentive to change things. Thirdly, they're often just far fewer, and you're often able to settle a lot quicker because they're obviously much more financial pressure because you have to hire lawyers and they're expensive and things like that. And so it means that you're unable to actually get many of these civil cases out in the first place. And fourthly, this is just not mutually exclusive, right? So clearly, at the point that opening option never demonstrated why this is specifically unique, you can also have like criminal prosecutions for sexual assault and also civil cases. We're happy to have that on our side as well. At the point they never demonstrated unique, that point, I think the OL comparative falls. No, thank you. First of all, then, why is it that we get more public prosecutions and why we think that leads to systemic changes? First of all, I think it's important to demonstrate why there are currently very little prosecutions for police brutality. First of all, I think it's hard to identify who specifically is responsible. Whether that officer made a mistake was the fault of the individual police chief, it's very hard to specifically point to one specific instance or one specific mechanism because there are many different factors that lie as a result of who is responsible. But secondly, and most importantly, there's often a massive lack of evidence to be able to actually prove culpability. Because often when investigators go in to investigate police departments, police officers close up ranks because these are often very closed up groups because they have to rely on each other for safety. They've been training for years, etc. They know each other, they're probably friends and family. So at that point, it's very difficult to gather that evidence to get someone to rat on somebody else when it's a very, very close-knit group. Secondly, though, no thank you. There's often very high sympathy for these officers. Because A, if you're a police officer, if you can literally go to a jury and say, look, my life was on the line, I have a family, I have kids, I want to get out of that area alive, and I might have made a mistake, but I did what I thought was best. That often accrues a lot of sympathy for anybody who is trying somebody who's a police officer. But secondly, at least they can just appropriate that blame to the police chief who's unlikely to get prosecuted. Secondly, because they're often pretty politically well connected, it means that often city governments don't want to prosecute these individuals because they know each other and things like that. The third thing is that currently there's an active incentive to cover evidence and to avoid those trials because there's no harm in doing so because you're able to easily cover that evidence. And because usually what happens is in these cases, you just fire the police chief. It never actually comes to a criminal prosecution. It usually gets buried under the rug. So often means there's a lot of incentive not to even get that evidence out in the first place. And fourthly, most importantly, there's often very difficult to establish intent, as I think the top have recognized. So it means that, crucially, governments and district attorneys do not prosecute for police brutality.
Information?
It's very, very hard to win because there's a massive lack of evidence to be able to do so. Yeah.
Who?
PY?
Who?
Yeah, who?
Opening or closing?
Oh, closing half.
Police chiefs were amongst the first people to push for body cams to record evidence that allowed for the prosecutions of individual police officers in the first place. Why would that happen on your side?
Okay, I'm literally going to explain this later, but in short, it's because now they have an active incentive to show every single thing that they do in order to avoid a prosecution for criminal negligence. They have a far greater incentive to bring out that evidence and to be far more open. Secondly, though, why is it that we get far more prosecutions on our side of the house? First of all, now that the prosecutorial basis has changed from intent to criminal negligence, it means there's a far lower threshold to be able to try to convict in the first place. Because now it's about whether you created that culture, whether you've proven over many years that you've demonstrated that safety training, whether you followed the correct procedures, whether you rooted out bad officers and fired them. Now it's a much lower threshold to be able to prove that you were indeed criminally negligent. But secondly, there's far more evidence to be able to do so. No, we're going to flip the op material here. They try to claim that's far more likely to be going to cover up under their side. Note that at the point you're far more incentivized to show this information to demonstrate that you were not criminally liable because you followed all the correct procedures, that your officers were doing that correctly, you're probably going to be far more likely to commit to showing that evidence at the point where there's no harm to cover up. And the third thing is far more likely to be able to get that trial and to be able to convince a jury at the point when people are far less sympathetic to a bureaucratic police chief, but also people are very unsympathetic to evidence of criminal negligence in a position of power. What is the impact of this argument? First of all, at the point we get more prosecutions, we get more justice, but secondly, we get more of these trials. Now, these don't have to be successful. At the point when we get public pressure and publicity, because big criminal prosecutions for criminal negligence get a lot of media coverage. You get far more likely to get protests and big social movements weighing in and mean that people actually pay attention. This is really important because, first of all, now police chiefs and city governments have far more incentives to actually do the correct things that mean that protect people safe. They're putting body cameras on police, putting active watchdogs and preventing cover-ups because they're far more likely to want to get to blame the officers for doing bad things. Thirdly, rooting out like corruption and bad officers, and fourthly, actually getting compensation for these victims. This is important for these victims because they're far more likely to be able to see things like a coroner's report and seeing the person who perpetrated that brutality on trial. Ladies and gentlemen, we get the change on our side, the point where we get far more publicity from a criminal trial. That's why it's the unique mechanism to hold these people accountable. So proud to propose.
Great. I thank that speaker and call upon the member of opposition. Hear, hear.
Look, I think OO had a nice case on principle, but they really skimmed over how this policy makes police brutality much worse. In CO, we're going to take Gov's burden on that police commanders have power. We're going to show you how they're going to abuse that power in a way that leads to bad outcomes for the main actors in this debate. Rebuttal will be at the end if I have time. If not, Andrew will do it in whip. So, first of all then, police commanders have an active incentive not to be sued under this policy. Why? One, because they just don't want to lose their jobs, which I think is a natural incentive for people to have. But two, and crucially, you don't want to lose your job in a necessarily a bad fashion, because realistically, if you lose your job and be sued under this policy, you're going to be framed as genuinely an evil person. Because notice that all people will know that you lost your job and you were sued for being responsible for something that society has a big problem with. We think that is something that is highly damaging to your long-term prospects as an individual, and therefore something that these police officers are going to try and stay away from in the vast majority of cases. OG, and to a certain extent CG, try and frame this out by saying that they'll only prosecute these kind of police officers who don't take their responsibility properly. I think this is insanely hard to stop and ensure that that happens in the vast majority of cases, because people do these things for a vast majority of different reasons. It's untrue that you can literally stop every one of them as a police commander, but even if you can stop all of them, there's probably a mindset within these commanders that tells them that they aren't going to be able to solve these things, and that makes them likely to try and avoid these outcomes in any way that they can. We think that this leads to a load of bad outcomes, meaning it's really hard to get these any sort of police reform under our side under their side of the house. We've got three mechanisms under this. The first is that it often gets in the way of any sort of police accountability metrics. As OO rightly point out in their kind of 10-20 seconds of analysis on this, they probably are more likely to do things like dispose of evidence. They're probably going to be against things like body cameras. But also what we're going to note in CO, and this is really important, but they're also going to do things like try and discredit witnesses, because we think that is true, that it probably gets harder to prosecute under this policy because of the mechanisms that OO give you. But crucially, it's also about the fact that it becomes really difficult to come out and talk about police brutality when the institution of police commanders try and delegitimize you in every way that you can. We think that makes it coming out and talking about these things ultimately traumatic, and in the long term makes people way more likely to come forward with these people when these police commanders with a asymmetry of power do everything in their power to delegitimize you, to ensure that they don't lose their jobs and don't get sued like GovBench want them to. The impact of that is all sorts of things that they're trying to solve get worse in the long term. If police commanders are and the situations are as bad as they claim it is, it gets worse in the future. The second mechanism in this, and I'm going to flag that this is completely new from CO, is it's harder to get sort of police reforms in the police into the future. Because notice that lots of teams miss this in the debate, that we have got a long way to go in terms of getting loads of police accountability as a whole. Because 10 years ago or 20 years ago, it wasn't a norm that police officers around on the streets would use things like body cameras. That is something that is being phased out across police forces all over the world. We think that under this policy, when police commanders have an active incentive to cover up evidence like that, you step in the way of all that sort of progress, because it's crucial framing in this debate that it's untrue that we've reached a stage where you have lots of accountability. We need to have loads more accountability in the future, and we think you curb that accountability and that reform in the long term. We think that you're more likely to step it in the way of that at the point in which you're more likely to be sued for doing so. But the third mechanism under this argument, and this is crucial and new from CO, is that we think oftentimes the problem is not necessarily in some sorts of police forces, but also in certain areas within those police forces. Because notice that police brutality is sky high in some areas of the United States and really low in other areas. We think that happens for a variety of reasons. It's probably because of like social norms and police forces in those areas. No, thank you. But it's also about the type of commanders that you have in those areas, because we agree that commanders have a large degree of say and a large degree of claim over the types of actions of their subordinates to a certain degree. But we also realize on closing opposition that there are also good and bad commanders that exist under the status quo. The type of good ones are the type of people who are going to be forwarding the ideas that both sides think are good in terms of having more accountability and more reform in terms of the police. I think it's really important that these good commanders go to the places where they're most needed. That is to say, the places where police brutality is most prevalent, for instance, some areas of the United States. The problem with this policy, I'll take you in a moment, Senkai, is I think this policy makes it really difficult to persuade any of these good commanders to go to these areas because they think that might harm their career progress, because they might be sued for doing so in the long run or held criminally liable. That means it's really hard to get any progress in these places because the sort of ideas that come from progressive police commanders don't filter down into these areas, and therefore you have much more inequality in terms of policing and much more brutality in those sorts of areas. That's crucial extension material from the CO. Before I go on to a bit of rebuttal, go.
Currently, you can cover up when there's no criminal liability. But the way that you prove your innocence is to be open and to show that you're doing things to prevent brutality, like putting body cameras and compensating victims.
Here's the problem. You cannot literally have evidence for every little thing that your subordinates do on a day-to-day level. That means it is really difficult to take into account all the sorts of things that you guys are talking about on CG. It's a way easier mechanism to avoid your accountability when you just try and cover that up like we told you they will. Let's do some broad rebuttal. First with OG. OG's main claim is that police brutality is identifiable. A few responses. One, I think that often people don't have background when they commit these sorts of things, and they just react in things like the heat of the moment. Two, I think mental illness and the type of things that OG talk about are like really poorly understood and really hard to identify, meaning it's really hard to identify these sorts of things before they happen. Three, people just don't talk about these issues. I think what we proved to you on CO is we're going to have way more ability to hold people to account. The CG extension is basically that it's really difficult to hold these people to account, and therefore we should just make it easier for them. Panel, I think this logic is broadly insane. Just because prosecuting someone is hard, it doesn't make it a reason to get rid of all of the accountability metrics that make the justice system work. Look, the CO extension was simple. If police brutality is bad in the status quo, it gets 100 times worse under their side of the house. Very proud to oppose.
Great. I thank the member of opposition and call upon the government whip. Here.
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, all good.
We agree with closing opposition that most of the benefits of justice and of closure for victims only happen when good practical events occur. We also think that future victims are far more important than present victims because they're just more numerous, and preventing someone from dying is sadly better than giving victims closure. In a choice between maybe some more justice for these police commanders and a much better functioning justice system that incentivizes cities to hold the police more accountable, we prefer the former. I'm going to talk about the CO case and how our case interacts with it. Then I'm going to weigh that against the principal clash coming mostly out of opening, and also talk about what we add to that clash. What is Senkai's claim, essentially? Because they barely respond to any of it. Senkai's claim is two things. First, that under the status quo, it's very, very hard to prosecute police brutality at all, to put someone on a stand, to have a trial in public where someone says, your son died because X, Y, Z, and there's someone you can blame for that. We think that just having those trials and providing them is a benefit in of itself, because it gives victims closure and it creates the kind of public scandal that leads to people losing their jobs badly, as CO say. We think that that's good because it provides all the deterrent effects. And by showing that you get far more trials and far more publicity to this, Senkai's analysis, which isn't really responded to, can already claim some very substantial wins there. But more importantly, Senkai shows you why you now have incentives to be open as a police force. This engages very directly with the entire CO case, because their analysis, and it's the same as opening opposition's limited practical analysis, is that because you don't want to be prosecuted and lose your job, you have an incentive to cover things up. Note the way opening government set this up. Opening government correctly, I think, set this up as criminal negligence. That means that you have taken on a certain responsibility and don't fulfill it when you fail to do certain actions. I think this is a fairly good framework for doing this, but it also means that the way to avoid getting prosecuted or the way to limit your sentence is to just do things by the book. And the status quo is not doing things by the book, right? It took 3 months for a grand jury to be summoned in the trial of Ahmed, of the person in Georgia. We think that that wasn't even a case where a police officer was involved. It's an ex-police officer, and police are structurally unable and unwilling to prosecute other police officers. And for the same reasons that closing opposition say, right? They don't want to lose their job. They don't want the backlash. So under the status quo, they still cover up evidence. They still intimidate witnesses. What changes is that the way to avoid getting in prison now is to show that you're playing by the book and that you're doing everything possible to avoid police brutality. That doesn't mean you have to get it right 100% of the time, because we think that far more important than losing your job badly is getting a shorter jail sentence, or maybe getting no jail sentence at all and community service, or maybe being found innocent. And you can show that by getting rid of all the signs of negligence, which make it almost impossible to prosecute police brutality cases at the moment. This is not just an incentive for the heads of police, it's also an incentive for the city as a whole. Under the status quo, they know because these crimes are so hard to prosecute, this will probably go away quite soon. Whereas when you have an easier crime to prosecute and you might have your head of police on the stand, you have an incentive to provide the media, to provide prosecutors every piece of evidence out there showing that the person who committed this act of police brutality was a lone wolf. Even if they weren't a lone wolf, this is a marked improvement on what we have under the status quo, because police chiefs now, because they have this incentive of getting themselves off the hook, are far more willing to show the family of victims their beloved's body or show them evidence of their final moments. We think that these things are very powerful. They're also powerful in sparking change. You're far more likely to get change when that change is going to be something which in a courtroom could be the difference between you going to prison and not. They then talk about making it harder for victims to come out and talk. The problem with this mechanism is that it doesn't understand who the witnesses are in these cases, right? Given that this is a case about professional negligence, we think that these witnesses will be other police officers as opposed to the actual relatives of the victims, because the witnesses need to testify about the culture. No. We think so, even where there is witness harassment and witness intimidation, it's mostly going to be toward other police officers, which is already an improvement on the status quo. But note, in trials of, say, the lone wolf, the bad apple, whatever you want to call them, we think that now the rest of the police force is far more likely to take the side of victims, because that will show that their culture isn't as toxic as people generally claim, because that's what the new law requires to get them off. So we think it's far more favourable to victims on our side of the house when you give the police force incentives to rally behind them and to root out the bad apples, even if it's only just to avoid getting locked up. We think the practical impact of this is that you get things like body cameras far more quickly, because whatever CO say, body cameras are not widespread at the moment, and they don't look to be anytime soon. Yes, I'll take closing.
If your subordinate shoots someone, you might still be prosecuted on your side of the house. If police officers has the incentive, as you say them, surely it's safer to cover it up altogether.
Okay, let me just walk through this. You can't cover up the fact that a police officer shot someone. That's a very difficult thing to cover up. What's even more suspicious is when you refuse to respond to requests for evidence from a prosecuting authority, when you make their life very difficult in prosecuting the police officer who pulled the trigger. That's the point at which your own prosecution is at risk. We think that you have an incentive to cooperate with authorities who are looking to prosecute police officers, because that's the only way to keep you from being on the line. Like, there's only so much you can cover up. In the case in which someone has been shot, someone now is going to be prosecuted and brought to trial. And whether that's the police officer or whether that's their superior, we think it's better for victims and it's better for social justice that someone is on a witness stand and there is positive publicity about this. And note that our case doesn't even rely on these trials happening or these trials being successful. We think it only relies on the threat of these trials forcing police officers to open up, forcing police commanders to open up their evidence and cooperate with authorities in a way that they systematically do not at the moment, because most police forces are racist. We think that's a massive win on our side. And look, whoever wins the opening half clash about justice, we think in reality, most of our intuitions about justice come from our desire not to see victims suffer, to want to give victims' families a sense of closure. We can do that on our side of the house when we can give them the trials, when we can give them the closure of someone admitting that there was something wrong and the state taking your side on it in a courtroom. We think that that's powerful, but even more powerful is preventing more people getting shot when we provide much firmer practical incentives for police officers to put in proper accountability. And at that point, we win this debate from closing government. Very proud to oppose.
Great, we thank the government whip and call upon the opposition whip. Here.
Is this okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
The assumption of this government was that we know about all cases of police brutality in the first instance, and the central question was about how we apportion responsibility. But as we just heard from the previous speakers, body cams still have a very long way to go before they become the norm. And less than 10 years ago, they were not a thing. Dashboard cameras were not a thing. Internal policies to even review these forms of police brutality were not a thing. And they still aren't a thing in many parts of this world. The crucial question is that responsibility at the end of the day is merely the means by which we try and eradicate police brutality. And in closing opposition, our claim was that the journey to eradicating these forms of brutality is still very, very long. And that in order for these reforms to not stay fragile and to become the norm, we need the cooperation of those who are at the top, i.e. police chiefs. We need those who are the cream of the crop, i.e. the very best of police chiefs, to be willing to invest their career in going to these incredibly high-risk areas where the culture is incredibly toxic, to be willing to change these cultures in the first instance and to enact reforms that ensure that brutality does not become a thing in the future. We took on what Johnny very kindly said was about future victims and tell you how we prevent that from happening in the future. 2 points. Firstly, on the government's really only point about responsibility and getting prosecutions, and secondly, about reforms which Johnny just did not want to engage with in the first instance. On responsibility, I think government's assumption here, and Senkai sort of highlights this, was that this comparative on our side of the house was supposedly that no one would be liable if we didn't hold the police chiefs liable in the first instance. This is quite silly because, as Hugh quite rightly points out, we can just hold individual beat cops liable for the instances. The only response that we really got was from closing government, who said, but it's very hard to hold someone accountable. The fact that something is very hard does not mean that we shouldn't do it, nor that we should find better ways to do it. And what Hugh tells you here is that police chiefs very often are the ones who cooperate, no thank you, with police prosecution efforts to try and find individual officers liable in the first instance. They were the ones who, in the Trayvon Martin case, and later on with all of the other cases in America, to offer body cameras as a trial so that they could get more evidence. The reason this is the case on the comparative of us on our side of the house is because you want to cooperate with local communities so that you can earn their trust. You want to find someone liable, and when your neck is not on the line because you are also going to be at risk of going to jail, you are more likely to cooperate. The only response then that we got from closing government here was the claim that, but if you want to make sure that you're not going to go to jail, you are going to show that you have done everything by the book. Newsflash, you can do everything by the book and still be found negligent. But here's the structural reason why showing more evidence is unlikely and why you're going to want to cover up. Because you don't want to incriminate yourself in the first instance. But more importantly, the fact just showing evidence does not mean that you're going to be found in favor. A jury could still interpret it in a manner that is bad and adverse to you, which means that you're still going to be found liable. There's so much uncertainty within the context of a jury trial and what the court can do with the evidence that the better way to create certainty that you will never be found liable, no thank you, is to not review the evidence in the first instance, which is why closing government's argument about negligence and doing things by the book and showing more evidence just does not square the reality of how courts interpret evidence in the first instance. But more crucially, the reason why you're not negligent, no thank you, is because very often, a lot of these police officers just have no background of mental illness, unlike what opening government claimed. They do things in the heat of the moment because they are scared, as Hugh tells you, for their lives. But even if you know about mental illness, the thing is that mental illness is still very poorly understood, and the ways of trying to deal with it are still not understood very, very well. All of this suggests that police chiefs just can't really deal with these in ways, and they're more likely to react by hiding this evidence. The very best scenario, I think, Madam Speaker, for the government is that if you do in fact show all of this evidence, given that the culture between police and the public is fairly toxic in the areas that we are talking about, right, where police trust of the police is already so low, they're just going to be seen as trying to justify their actions. And that's only going to mean that you reduce the type of trust that you have from the public, reduce the type of political capital that is so necessary in these areas to get the types of reforms in the first place, which is our second point. At the conclusion of this, I think what Hugh showed you, I'll take you in a moment, is that these forms of responsibilities or attempts to pin responsibility is only going to be incredibly perverse. It's only going to force these chiefs who know they're now in the same boat as their subordinates to make sure that those boats don't sink, to hide the evidence, to discredit witnesses, to intimidate them. And we think those are actively perverse incentives that we would rather avoid, which is why we think this policy is bad. Before that, I think that was closing.
Yeah, so we think there are problems with juries interpreting evidence, which is why prosecutors will generally offer plea deals and agreements to be witnesses in a trial of a bad apple, etc., which all mean more justice because prosecutors are smart.
Plea deals are the worst thing you can do for justice, because it means, if anything, that if you cooperate, you're not going to jail. That contradicts opening government's own point about trying to send these people to jail. So I don't think that actually quite squares. So let's talk about reforms. And closing government's claim about trying to get more evidence and showing that you've everything do by the you're doing everything by the book is reform of a very superficial kind, because it's just about creating paper trails. It's about creating bureaucracy, but not actually instigating actual police reform. Because if you listen very closely to what closing government tells you, all they're saying is that the types of reforms is making sure that everything is out in the open right now, and making sure that they have something to cover their asses if the prosecution comes knocking at their door. What Hugh tells you is that actual reforms happen, and this is targeted at future victims. So thanks, Johnny, for that point. What Hugh tells you is that beyond cover-ups, which we think are already quite terrible for victims, this is simply one small piece of a broader trend of needing to eradicate police brutality by instigating things and making sure that they're part of a norm of things like body cams, of dashboard cams, of having these internal policies. And if it's true that it's a systemic problem, then we need to ensure that police chiefs have that incentive to stay in the job and to want to do it well. But crucially, the bit of Hugh's analysis that did not go responded to, and which was incredibly important, is that we get the very best police chiefs, those who have stellar records, to want to go into these areas to eradicate things like racism, to eradicate things like xenophobia, and to ensure that these reforms get put in the first place, to want to go onto the ground to see how things are being ironed out and ensure that these forms of police brutality do not happen in the first place. The incentive for them exists because they want to ensure, to build a reputation to ensure that they have a future career. But that is always going to be stymied if they know that criminal liability is on the line. On our side of the house, we give you the only journey towards ensuring that no one else is ever killed again by a police gun. We're very, very proud to oppose.
Great. I thank all speakers for the debate. Really great job. Gonna stop recording now.